Welcome to Vermont's Voice, your source for the public interest conversation in the State House and beyond. I'm your host, Jordan Hayden. Throughout this series, we'll be investigating some of Vermont's most pressing issues by connecting with leaders and community members all around the state. Together, we'll learn, laugh, and explore opportunities for grassroots action to keep Vermonters engaged and to keep Vermont cool. So stick around. Today's episode is all about immigration, so I'll be sitting down with Jill Martin Diaz, Executive Director of the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, or VAAP. I'll also be connecting with my co-producer, Elijah. This is Vermont's Voice. So, hey, Elijah.
Hello, Jordan.
How does it feel to be here next to me behind this desk?
It's a little weird. I'm usually way back over there behind the camera and the monitors that you all can't see at home.
Right.
Here I am today.
Do you have a preference so far of which desk you prefer to be behind?
You know, these are really bright lights, but it's a little claustrophobic back there, so I think I want to stay here.
They are pretty bright, right? But it makes us look... Yeah, this is your...
Gotta look pretty.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering if you have had a chance to visit the largest zipper in North America yet.
How does one visit a zipper?
It's a tourist attraction.
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay. Well, what I can tell you is that it's not far from here.
Uh-huh.
It's...
Is in Vermont?
Yeah. It's the largest zipper in North America.
Wow.
This is news to you.
This is news to me. What does one zip with the largest zipper in North America?
Well, I will tell you that it's not functional. You can't actually zip it. But it's fairly long. It's 74 feet long. And it's comprised completely of granite. Does that give you any indication of where it might be located?
Are we in Barrie?
Yes, that's where it's located. And I think it's important to mention because Barrie at one point was considered the granite capital of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that?
That I did know.
Okay, so we're back on track now. And I will just say this is more so considered an art sculpture, so I kind of tricked you with that. Sorry. It's called Unzipping the Earth by a local artist named Chris Miller. And there's lots of granite around Barrie because, again, it was once the granite capital of the world. But I thought for the intro to this episode, I could give you a brief little history lesson that I just thought would be fun.
I love history.
Okay, cool. And I might ask you a question or two. We'll see how you do.
All right.
Okay, so when rail transportation began, and we had access to that in the country around the 1880s, let's say, the granite industry really exploded in many places, but also in Barrie, Vermont, right? And so this brought in lots of stonecutters, sculptors, and quarrymen to Barrie that weren't previously there. And so in the creation and the development of this industry, residents would start to establish quarries and manufacturing sheds, tool companies, and other businesses that really helped to support that industry and the growing population. So, in 1880, the population of Barrie was 2,000. Okay? Can you guess what it was by 1910?
Let's say we're going to double it, 4,000.
Nope.
No.
Higher.
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 5,000.
Higher.
6.
Higher.
10.
Higher.
Holy moly.
I know.
15.
Okay, it's not that.
Not that high.
Okay, it's 12.
That's
12,
a lot of
000.
people.
More than 12,000. Yeah, 12 and some change. That's pretty impressive, right?
That's really impressive.
And you might be wondering, how is that possible, Jordan? Where did all of these people come from?
Where did all these people come from, Jordan?
I'll tell you. Okay, so they came from Italy, Scotland, Spain, Scandinavia, Greece, Lebanon, Canada, and many others. Those are just the primary countries. Can you guess why I might be bringing this conversation to you today?
Is it because today's episode's about immigration?
It is. We are talking about immigration today. Spot on. And I think it's just really important to give this one example, right? There are many, but this one example of economic growth and prosperity and what can happen when we blend cultures and communities together. And so I wanted to give a little more context of where we're at today, because that's obviously a historic example, right? We're a long way past 1880s, but I can give you some information of what Vermont is looking like and what our immigration community looks like today.
Yeah, educate me.
Okay. So, in 2022, the American Immigration Council reported that there were 25,000 foreign-born residents or immigrants in Vermont, and that made up 3.9% of the state's population. With that community brought $619 million in spending power and $226 million in paid taxes.
I feel like something people forget all the time is that immigrants or anybody visiting this country, they still pay taxes.
Right. Yeah. Like
that's money in our pockets.
A lot of taxes. Yeah. $226 million just in 2022.
That's a lot of money.
I know. And the Migration Policy Institute was able to offer even more data on this. Okay. So 32% of immigrants in Vermont came from Asia, 31% from Europe, 16% from Northern America, 12% from Latin America, and 9% from Africa. And honestly, I just thought that was really cool.
It's a really, really big spread.
Yeah.
Very multinational Vermont.
Yeah. So I know this was 2022. It's been a few years since then, but I still thought this was valuable data. And again, more recent than the 1800s. So just thought I would bring some of that historic and more recent context for this episode, because again, we're talking immigration. I imagine it might be a little bit heavier in terms of conversations we've had before, but it feels really timely and important and valuable. So I'm hoping that our listeners will stay tuned. And I don't know, if you have any other thoughts on the episode today, I'll let you share them now.
Stay tuned. It's going to be a good one.
I'm sitting down with Jill Martin Diaz, Executive Director of the Vermont Asylum Assistance Project, or VAAP. We're also being joined by Jill's pup, Penny. Want to say hi, Penny?
Thanks for having us.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Now, a little bit about VAAP. VAAP exists to raise Vermont non-citizens' awareness of and access to critical immigration legal help and support. Now, aside from all that they do at VAAP, Jill is also partnering with Connecting Cultures as their legal director, as well as serving on Vermont Judiciary's Access to Justice Coalition, regional and national committees of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and Vermont Clear Legal Professionals co-founding leadership team. I hear you've also just taken up a teaching job as well, correct?
Yes.
So you're staying extremely busy. So thank you again for being here, and welcome to Vermont's Voice.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So just touching on that a little bit more, the sort of chaos of your current schedule and all that's really going on in the world right now, I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what a typical day or week looks like for you, if typical is even a thing at the moment.
What a good way to put that question. As a new organization, it's hard to say anything is typical. Ooh, salud. So I would say that our typical day was already pretty scrappy and stretched thin and busy because we're a startup nonprofit and a startup legal services program. And I, in my one seat, play the role of supervising attorney and subject matter expert. And I am a supervisor of personnel, and I develop the board, and I fundraise, and I'm IT and HR. And I curate a public education website and do lots of advocacy. So it's already a wild gig. I try to remind myself that the intensity of the last few weeks and months have really, they've definitely dialed up and intensified what was already a stressful time. And I say that to myself to try and remember, to keep myself grounded and pace myself, because it's only been a couple weeks, and it's going to. We have to pace ourselves. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. And I quite literally just met you, but I feel like your energy is so good and so positive, and you're just smiling through it all. And so I don't know. I wanted to note that and commend you for that, because I know that the work is hard, and you just listed many jobs that you're doing. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. So
thank you. I mean, I think that it's awful. I can't quite look directly at the scale of harm that's happening in our communities and the harm that's yet to come for individual folks. And at the same time, here I am on this podcast talking to you really about pre-existing injustices, right? The immigration legal system has been this unjust the whole time. And I'm sad that it took this moment and this level of harm to bring these issues to the forefront. But I also feel really motivated to take this opportunity to help folks understand just how unfair the system has always been,
Right.
and what folks can do to help make their neighbors and family members' lives a little better.
Great. And that's definitely what we're going to be getting into today. And just for some ground setting here, I know that you're already aware of this, Jill, but since President Trump's, entry into the White House, he's only reaffirmed his commitment to cracking down on immigration in the United States, right? And also with these numerous executive order attempts, I think it's completely fair and valid that there is a deep concern among non-citizen and citizen communities. And so, again, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. We're going to get into it, I think, pretty deeply. But the first thing I want to mention, two things I want to mention are terms that I think we'll probably use an abbreviation or using acronyms for that I just want to give some clarity to, because some folks may not know what those things stand for. So first, I'd just like to mention that ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP stands for Customs and Border Protection.
I think I'll say off the top that anything I'm going to share with you in response to your questions comes from nationally vetted information shared by colleagues and national organizations and bar associations that we affiliate with. And it's available to everyone right now on our website at www.vaapvt.org. That's vaapvt.org. And there are curated self-help resource libraries there that will cover everything that we're about to talk about, including in multimedia formats.
Great. Thank you so much for plugging that. The website is truly great. I can attest to it, and we will be linking it in the description to this episode.
Awesome.
Alrighty, so let's get into it. So the VAAP website states the number of people seeking asylum in the U.S. has nearly quintupled over the past decade. Without legal counsel, asylum seekers face enormous challenges in obtaining work authorization and meeting basic needs. They are also 3 to 5 times more likely to be denied asylum and deported, often to life-threatening situations. So I'm wondering if we could start here with some really basic table setting and just explain why non-citizens might be seeking asylum in the United States in the first place, or even more specifically in Vermont.
There's a few basic concepts about how the U.S. immigration system works that I think are helpful to get on the table. One is this concept of forced migration. Internationally, there are push factors and pull factors that draw people away from their homelands because it is not safe for them to be there to meet their emotional or mental needs, to meet their social needs, or it might not even be possible for them to meet their physiological needs on their homelands. And so factors might pull people or push people to asylum seeking in countries where that's an option. Historically, the U.S. immigration system has been comparatively functional compared with asylum systems around the world. Asylum law comes from international law that followed World War II. All the signatories agreed that that countries would not return people to persecution, a severe form of harm. And then in 1980, the U.S. added this level of protection through the Refugee Act, which gave asylum seekers a pathway to citizenship, a pathway to permanency in the U.S., which is above and beyond what the international floor was set. That's why people choose the U.S., right? And there's a lot of U.S. foreign policy and economic pressures and climate change pressures that the U.S. is absolutely a driver of that forces people to migrate away from their homelands. And so for many of us who work in this space feel that it is the minimum that the U.S. could do to provide a place of refuge for folks who can't meet their needs in their homelands for reasons relating to U.S. actions. And people might make their way to Vermont in particular because there are relatively humane laws here, not just for immigrants, but for people. Right. There are a lot of state laws that add on to the protections, the civil rights and human rights protected in federal law. Vermont often goes a step further and adds protected classes to anti-discrimination laws and enshrines certain civil liberties in our Constitution and in state law. So, Vermont is known in the states in being a place where we take human rights seriously, and we don't settle for the federal floor. Especially, which is great because the federal floor has now fallen out from under us, right? But what people are seeking, there is a scholar out in California whose name escapes me now, But I cite to her on our blog. And she talks about the main pathways to regularized immigration status flow from blood, sweat, or tears. So the U.S. immigration law will give you status based on your family relationships or your blood, your labor relations, or like the value that you can add as a worker, and based on what we value, or your sweat, and then also the bad things that have happened to you, your tears. And that tears-based work is what we do at VAAP. It's typically, asylum is one example and the best known example, but there are several different humanitarian tears-type protections in U.S. immigration law. And they stem from bad things that have happened to you in your country of origin, or since coming to the U.S., or bad things that will happen to you if you're forced to return. And those kinds of cases have really complicated legal standards. They are, the clients are traumatized by virtue of needing to seek those statuses, and then the experience of seeking them is traumatizing. So it's very technical, time-intensive work that the private sector really can't provide for. And so that's why nonprofits like mine tend to do asylum and related type humanitarian work.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for that explanation. I feel like I learned so much in just that one question. And I think that historical context often gets left out of the conversation here in the US. So really important that you touched on all of that just now. So thank you. All right. So between 2024 and 2034, the Congressional Budget Office projects that immigration will reduce US deficits by $900 billion and increase federal revenues by $1.2 trillion. So how does Vermont benefit from this particular metric, and what do we gain from immigrant communities in general?
Vermont just published some Vermont-specific data that we've been focusing on in our research and advocacy. There is just really great data proving that immigrants are good for Vermont's economy. To focus on Vermont, because this is where I practice, we have a demographic crisis, right? Our population is declining, and economists and social scientists who have much more expertise than me have drawn straight lines between our demographic crisis and our affordable housing crisis, our workforce shortage crisis. And they've just issued this economic plan for Vermont to ensure a sustainable and maybe even prosperous future for our state. And in migration and promoting in migration, new people, immigration is the number 3 strategy that's recommended for the state of Vermont. And it's interesting because we do have a really, really vibrant immigrant community. Working age families immigrants are the fastest growing demographic of working age families. Immigrants are 80% more likely to engage in entrepreneurship or fill jobs in fields with labor shortages. Immigrants contribute to taxes at all levels, to Social Security, to Medicaid, to sales tax, to everything. And the state of Vermont has published data showing that immigrants are the future, our social and economic future here in Vermont. And it's what a bad time for us to be facing so many outside existential threats to our ability to support our immigrant community, to stay here, to stay safe, to live their lives, to continue resettling and integrating, or for some folks who have been here a really long time to just continue living the only life that they've ever known.
Right.
And the data bears out nationwide that immigrants are good. And it's sad as a person with humanitarian ethics to need to reduce people to
Data.
labor, data profitability. But fortunately, the data speaks for itself.
Right.
And so even, we can set aside the humanitarian piece for a moment, because I do resonate. I've practiced poverty law generally at Vermont Legal Aid before, and I resonate with this feeling of overwhelm in our community of just how many competing crises there are. But it's really interesting to look at this particular issue and see a direct through line between supporting immigrants in Vermont will help us to solve all of these other economic crises that are making it hard for us to support each other as a state.
Wow. That's really helpful. I feel like the way you lay it out makes it so obvious. Like, of course, this is a thing that we should all value within our communities. And I'm glad that a state like Vermont sees that. But clearly, there's more work to be done in other places and other levels where we just haven't quite cut through. All right. So yesterday, very timely, S-44 was introduced, which is a bill that would require the governor to get approval of the General Assembly before entering into certain immigration agreements, meaning the legislature would vote on any sort of collaboration that would take place between the state and ICE. Now, I want to get your perspective on this, and I know this is still very new and early and much more to be determined on the bill, but do you think that S-44 is a step in the right or wrong direction?
I think it is a step in the right direction.
Okay, great.
And I did testify on the record on request of Chair Sheem yesterday, and I continue to make myself available to offer subject matter expertise to our lawmakers. I wish that, of course, in an ideal world, I wish that the measures that we were able to put forward before the State House were even more aggressive around protecting Vermont's limited resources and refusing to be co-opted by nefarious federal forces to implement federal law. It is not the business of Vermont law enforcement to be implementing federal law, especially now we see the dangers of being involved and tangled in federal law enforcement when there is a policymaker in charge of federal law enforcement who clearly disregards basic constitutional rights, rule of law, humanity. Now we find ourselves entangled in those nefarious purposes, right? And it has a really chilling effect for the community. If we're telling our community members that it is safe to call law enforcement when they need protection, when they need emergency interventions, then we can't have our local law enforcement entangled in federal immigration actions.
Right.
It completely hurts the confidence and the safety that people feel. And the data has proven, and we saw in the last Trump administration, that the more afraid people are to call law enforcement, the more people suffer. And it flows on not just from law enforcement, right? So there's the acuity of people who need intervention from law enforcement, emergency help. There's a lot of attrition, kind of a chilling self-imposed isolation and disengagement from public society that comes from this effect of entanglement between local law enforcement and federal. This feeling that right in our community is this boogeyman company who could jeopardize my life. And we already are hearing reports of folks who are pulling their kids out of school, preschool. They're afraid to take their kids to the school bus pickup spot. Folks who are sheltering in place as though it's April 2020 all over again, like just truly not driving anywhere, missing health appointments. And public health and public safety suffer when we entangle ourselves with federal enforcement. And Vermont's resources, frankly, are too tight for us to be volunteering resources to the feds. So what S-44 would do is create some checks and balances on how the state decides to engage with, any federal contracts, federal partnerships. So one example is here in Vermont, Department of Corrections subcontracts bed space to the U.S. Marshals. The U.S., there's no federal facility in the state of Vermont of any kind. And so if U.S. law enforcement arrest someone and want to hold them in custody, they rent beds from Vermont DOC. And that includes for ICE purposes, for immigration enforcement. They have a limited time to keep a person detained, and then they would have to transfer them to an out-of-state ICE facility or release them on their own recognizance back into the community where they'll fight removal proceedings from home. I don't have a copy of the latest contract, the Intergovernmental Service Agreement, it's called, an IGSA. From a Public Records Request Act, I have a version from 2011, and that showed a $130 per diem that the feds would pay, like a kickback that the feds would pay the state to have people in beds, which A, creates this perverse incentive to fill the beds. B, it creates this incentive in the executive branch to accept kind of a quick buck, this like satisfaction of money paid in the immediate at the risk of all of these downstream public health and public safety costs, right? Because we know that when emergency interventions are the most expensive kinds,
Right.
And if we have people not going to healthcare, not going to school, not participating in public life, those are the kinds of factors that put people at risk of downstream emergency intervention. And so, I hear myself saying like, oh, but there's money. Yeah, it's a ruse, right? There's money. But then what are the actual costs to Vermont overall for having more people incarcerated and more communities disrupted?
Right. The impact of that is immeasurable, really. Right. Okay. So what I'm hearing is that the bill is maybe a good start, a beginning of something, but lacking in the sense that there's much more to be done, and would prefer to have more legislature and more legislation on this effort, right?
Yeah, but I do appreciate our lawmakers' efforts to at least create some more checks and balances, accountability to, more eyes on an issue, more eyes, more better. Right. So in S44, the proposition is to just create a kind of legislative check on, when the executive branch is considering a cost-benefit analysis to engage in contracts with the feds, that the legislature gets to consider it and weigh in too, just to make sure that all the different perspectives are being considered and all the different risks are being identified and weighed.
Gotcha. Well, I trust that you'll be keeping a close eye on everything that's happening in the State House.
Oh, I will.
So thank you. All right. So according to TRAC, the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, a bit of a mouthful, immigration courts have recorded nearly 244,000 new cases so far in FY25. Of those new cases, however, only 0.72% were based on any alleged criminal activity apart from possible illegal entry. I'm wondering if you could speak to that very small percentage, that 0.72%, because I'm really curious if it's common for non-citizens who are detained or deported to have absolutely no criminal history.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions about how immigration removal law works is this idea that a person is committing a crime by being unlawfully present, that immigration proceedings bear criminal consequences. There's a lot to be said about how severe banishment is as a form of punishment and how inappropriate it is that immigration proceedings are heard in an administrative court instead of a special Article I court or an Article III court that have more due process protections. But I'll set that aside because that's lawyer nerd stuff. What I'll say is that very, very few people who are being charged with removability and who are in removal proceedings and then ordered removed are folks who have had any criminal contact. If you think about banishment as one of the most severe forms of punishment akin to life without parole or capital punishment, it's pretty amazing that you can have someone who has only been arrested, and that maybe that's how they came to the attention of the immigration authorities. And then even if the charges are dropped, they're never guilty. They never are proven guilty or plead guilty. Their charges are dropped. Nevertheless, they'll be put into this removal proceeding and banished forever as a consequence. And that's what immigration removal proceedings are. So immigration law is separated into two halves. The first half creates pathways to regularize, right? Those blood, sweat, and tears pathways. The other half of immigration law was really expanded under the Clinton years, and then fully really actualized under the Obama years. The other half of the law is about taking those permissions away, right? So what are the different kinds of situations that might cause a person to lose their status? Criminal convictions, criminal legal involvement is just one of those buckets, but there's many buckets, including public health related ones, public charge related ones, which are very infamous now and play an outsized role in our discourse. That was a successful media campaign by Trump 1. But there's a few different types of things that can make a person removable, including what we would call civil immigration violations, like overstaying a visa, being present without permission, entering without inspection. And those are pretty routine. And that's the overwhelming majority of people being prosecuted in civil immigration court for enforcement of removability are those kinds of immigration infractions. The way it might play out is a person might have contact with the government either through an arrest or through some other means. Maybe they were the subject of some other court proceeding, or they were entering the U.S., or in Vermont's case, just driving too close to the border checkpoints, which happened to a Venezuelan family this week, which is horrific. And you come to the attention of authorities, even where a person might have pretty deep ties to the U.S. But if the government has reason to charge you with removability based on those immigration infractions, particularly if they can look at your situation and say you're a recent arrival, quote unquote, then you're owed a lot less due process in your removal proceedings, and you can be deported with a lot less access to a fair hearing, an opportunity to be heard, an opportunity to present evidence. So the government, like the law kind of incentivizes the government to look for people who have those immigration type of related grounds of removability and to prioritize removals for them because it lowers their burden, their prosecutorial burden. It's much easier to deport people that way. And then this idea of like immigration as a criminal violation or unlawful presence as a criminal violation, it's incredibly harmful. It's not true. And it's ironic because someone like me, I wish that immigrants who were respondents in removal proceedings were the benefit of the kinds of constitutional protections that we give criminal defendants in criminal matters. We don't. Instead, folks can be summarily what we call like expedited removal. They can be expeditiously removed with very little accountability or opportunities for review. So the criminal immigration overlap is a really important one, and I don't want to undermine, that it presents a real proportion of cases. But that's typically not how they're carrying out their purpose.
Wow. Yeah. That all feels very nebulous to me, sort of like whatever these folks say goes, and it just kind of happens. And I find that to be very unfortunate. Obviously, just looking at that number, I thought I misread it or just had bad information, but kept seeing that trend of these very low percentages. All right. So let's talk about what's happening locally here in Vermont. This year, VAAP has already confirmed ICE activity and arrests in the state. You've already mentioned a little bit of that, but I'm curious if this is more or less or sort of on par with what you would typically see in the state.
It's much more.
Okay.
So in the last few weeks, we've seen ICE arrests at a pace that would typically happen in a year in my practice. Wow. So, in recent years, we would have a couple of folks a year. Typically, someone comes into contact with law enforcement. Now, we do have a fair and impartial policing policy. So our law enforcement won't affirmatively alert, or they shouldn't affirmatively alert immigration authorities to, hey, I've got this person. They might be undocumented or removable. You should check it out. But they do, under Title 8 of the U.S. Code, they take your fingerprints and then they send that data to the national databases to check you against FBI like warrant databases, and ICE has access to that information. So if ICE decides to go looking, right, they've always had that option to come and find you if that was their choice. And like I said, for many folks, just the arrest, the damage is done. So Vermont has a lot of like treatment court, alternatives to detention, kind of pretrial diversion, and all of those science-based interventions to try and address underlying causes of criminal legal involvement, they fall by the wayside. Because if you are a visa overstay or unlawfully present or something, once the immigration authorities know about you and want to prioritize you for removal, they do. The harm is done, right? So in a typical year, we would have a couple of instances where folks are detained by ICE, typically after some kind of criminal legal arrest, some kind of involvement. And even though Vermont will do, the prosecutor and defense bar will come together to do amazing treatment-focused options, then the person's on a path to removal. And in many cases, will identify humanitarian protections for them. And because of that expedited removal process, by virtue of our border location, we still had a few clients that we've represented who were unlawfully deported in violation of their due process rights anyway. And as a really small shop, it's hard for us to seek recourse there. But folks can look at, the clients consented to us going to the media on those. Bernabe Suchite last year and also Gracie Mejia were two folks whose due process rights were not respected by immigration authorities and who were deported after ICE contact. Now we're seeing a lot more targeted arrests. So the folks that we've heard about who are facing, who have been in ICE contact are either folks who are intercepted in public places where ICE are lingering around and where they're allowed to conduct their border enforcement business. The U.S. Constitution says that they can't do it in a discriminatory manner, so they shouldn't be, for example, racial profiling and deciding who they're spot checking for papers. And so some people are being swept up that way. We heard of one person who was arrested in the Williston Walmart parking lot, for example. We know that there's been ICE officer sightings all over the state, including the Brattleboro, Hannaford, or the Virgins Western Union, driving up and down North Street in Burlington, where my office is. And if you happen to come upon an officer and they're conducting checks and they have reason to believe that you're not, that you're underdocumented and you confess the wrong facts, and whatever it is, then okay, you're caught in the immigration dragnet. We've also seen a couple of targeted arrests. So ICE officers or Homeland Security investigations as another armed enforcement branch of the department. They'll be kind of waiting in a vehicle a few paces away from a person's home who they want to target for enforcement. And then they don't need a warrant, right? Because they're not entering the person's home. The person exits their home and they say, "Hey, are you so-and-so?" You say, "Yes." And then they detain you and for immigration purposes. So we've seen a couple of those, and those have tended to be for folks who have had arrests, like even for de minimis charges. And then there are folks who just happen to be driving. There was a family this week from Venezuela that missed the last exit on 89 and accidentally arrived at the border checkpoint in Quebec. And they have two different pending applications for humanitarian relief. And their family was taken into custody. Mom and kids were released into the community. Dad was transferred to Plymouth, Massachusetts, to an ICE facility that's notorious. A lot of law school clinics on the coast have published about the horrific violations at Plymouth. And that's where he has to continue to pursue his humanitarian relief now, far from his counsel, far from his family and his support network.
That's terrifying. And you've just rattled off the top of your head many examples. And I'm sure there are more, because I also saw online that there was an issue with a staff member, a VAAP staff member. So I just personally can't imagine what that experience must be like. And I wonder, for an example of something like a road stop, if you could just speak, without giving, of course, any private information, if you could speak to that experience of that pullover and what that might be like for somebody.
I'm glad you asked, because we talk pretty casually as leaders of our community about knowing your rights. Everyone needs to know their rights. But something different happens in the moment when you have to assert your rights to a person who's wearing a uniform that represents something really scary and is armed, right? And you're not, especially if you're a person of color in Vermont, where we have like one of the worst records on racist policing and incarceration in the country. There's a lot kind of packed into that moment. So in a roadside stop, a person has rights to only open their window and ever so slightly, to clarify whether they're being detained or free to go, to ask the law enforcement officer to confirm what agency they're from, to not give their consent to further searches. You have all of these rights. And in the moment, a lot of people feel this compulsion to waive your rights to privacy from law enforcement if there's a chance you can de-escalate. And so I know a lot of, the immigration bar nationally informs people that if you have a pending application or a status, like keep photocopies of that on you. If you have a lawyer, keep a photocopy of proof of that relationship on you, so that if you encounter ICE in a stop, you can choose to waive your rights, your constitutional rights to privacy under the Fourth Amendment, and de-escalate by saying, hey, I'm not one of the people you're looking for, right? I am not removable. I am seeking a meritorious defense to my removal. Here's the proof. And it's problematic because for a lot of the folks who are the backbone of Vermont's like leading industries, agriculture, hospitality, construction, they're people for whom the immigration laws do not provide protections. They're people for whom the Fourth Amendment, their right to privacy from government, might be their only protection. And we can't put it on the shoulders, and this is to quote my friends at Migrant Justice, like we can't put the burden of keeping our constitutional rights to privacy alive solely on the most vulnerable members of our community.
Right.
So what I encourage people to do always is to think through, you're the expert in your own safety. Know that you have a few options available to you. And if you're in an allied positionality, if you have the ability to assert your Fourth Amendment rights and to hold the government to its burden to intrude in your privacy, consider doing so.
Great. Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. I don't think you knew this, but that was the next question I had was about know your rights. So I'm so glad that just sort of organically came up. And I do want to also mention that we will be linking resources again in the description of this episode with all of the know your rights information. And then you've also mentioned migrant justice, which was another area that I wanted to bring up because VAAP, in partnership with Migrant Justice, has developed this online form where individuals can report ICE or CBP activity in Vermont. I'm wondering if you could walk us through the process of filling out that form and let us know what takes place once a submission is received.
Certainly. So this was born of partner organizations, similar tracking in other states. I was practicing in New York during Trump 1.0 and Immigrant Defense Project. There was an organization I partnered with, and so I looked at their ICE tracker and thought, we need to create a database here in Vermont, if only because we need to have good, reliable information about the norms so that we can reassure the community with good information. These laws have always existed. This is not a Trump issue. This is an immigration law issue that predates this moment. And what created our false sense of security as a state around immigration enforcement was the norms, right? We practitioners could say, well, typically here's what we see. And right now in this era of misinformation, like deliberately being cultivated by algorithms on social media, it's really easy for, even in good faith, for misinformation to be shared like wildfire.
Yeah.
And one way that we want to help inform the community about how to move through Vermont safely is to try and track and report reliable data about what's actually seen. Like we know what the law says, but what are the norms looking like now? So when reports come in, I get a notification, and so do some of the organizers at Migrant Justice. Migrant Justice is looking at the report from a perspective of, does this person or their family who was left behind after the encounter need immediate support with accessing resources, with accessing legal counsel, with making sure that there is accountability and accompaniment for any continuing ICE activities if they're taken up to St. Albans or Richford for detention or proceedings. And so they're doing kind of rapid response. And, Migrant Justice, they're a movement organization for immigrant laborers, typically from Latin America. They operate mostly in Spanish. So it is a subpopulation that's not, that's their band, but there are other folks being prioritized for removal right now as well. And I'm watching for trends. So I try to use kind of my legal or I borrow from journalism, some verification methods of, I'm looking to see if there are reports, if there are multiple reports of the same incident, if it's from a very busy area, like when there's stuff reported from downtown Burlington, I'm looking to see if there are more than one, because Burlington is so dense. Like It would be unlikely that there was a huge ICE raid at Decker Towers that wasn't heavily reported.
Yeah.
I also get texted directly just by partners who want help connecting with legal counsel. So I'll look for patterns. I'll verify the data with trusted partners. I have regular meetings with fellow direct service providers in the immigrant services space, and we'll look at the spreadsheet of answers together. But we're really careful. We don't want to contribute. We don't want to fuel the fire of misinformation and like exacerbate this chilling effect that the Trump administration is having on public safety and public health in Vermont.
Absolutely. Well, I'm grateful that you're monitoring that. And it seems like you're keeping a close eye and paying attention to what could be misinformation, or hopefully nobody is doing it out of malice to sort of, sway the data.
Well, there are delivered bad reports.
Really?
Yeah. So, and I'm learning to look. So there are bad faith reports that are being submitted to throw the data. And then there's also trolling, like people who are bigoted and using bigoted language and submitting fake, mean reports with bigoted language and citing the Trump administration and MAGA. And I don't know. I'm not a tech wizard. I don't know if it's like a couple of people doing dozens of submissions. So I don't know if it's one, or if it's dozens of people. I have no idea. But there is a lot of noise to cut through, even on the tracker.
Wow. Sounds like it. That could be a full-time job in and of itself. And yet you do so much more than that. So thank you again for all of your hard work. It seems like a really valuable, important tool. And I'm sorry that you have to put up with all of the nonsense that comes along with that.
Thank you. If there are any data people out there that want to partner with us to take leadership on it, I am no data expert. So
yes, please ask for help. I'm sure our listeners might know someone.
I'm just some lawyer whose boss quit a few years ago.
They need help. Oh gosh. Okay. Let's see. I think we're kind of just flying through, and you've done such a great job of answering my questions. I guess something that I'd like to talk about is harassment generally. I did see recently on CNN that authorities in at least 3 states have arrested individuals that were allegedly impersonating ICE officers. Crazy. But I'm wondering what we can do in Vermont to better protect our own non-citizen and immigrant communities from harassment. Maybe like that, but just harassment broadly, right? I'm sure it exists in many forms.
Certainly. Yeah, we're hearing reports of bad actors who are impersonating immigration authorities and extorting...
In Vermont.
Wow. Extorting vulnerable community members. We're hearing of people misrepresenting themselves as competent or authorized legal practitioners. Like, I'll help you apply for immigration protection during this time, and they're just extorting people for money. We've heard of people be victimized that way through social media. Like, they'll get targeted advertising from an out-of-state shell company or someone who takes their money and promises them legal help, and then we review the documents and it's garbage. And maybe they've now brought themselves to the attention of government, even though they don't have a claim. And once you're like on their radar, if you're removable, right? So what can we do? Oh, actually, and before I start to talk about solutions, the other big bucket that we're seeing is not only like people feeling emboldened to engage in harassment activity in communities and daily life. We're also hearing about unlawful exclusion from housing and unlawful exclusion in the workplace. There are people who are misinformed about who is at risk and what risk that puts you as a landlord or you as a business owner at. And, I want to assume good intention. So let's assume that like it's a good faith mistake that someone is in danger of, getting into some kind of trouble that would jeopardize employment for a bigger group or housing for a bigger group. There are a lot of immigrants that live as co-tenants in rental properties. And now there's all these this discrimination that's happening that's actually a violation of federal and state law. So what can we do about it? The number one thing I would encourage folks to do is to support the bill being put forward to expand the Human Rights Commission's staffing. I was just testifying alongside Big Hartman, the executive director of the HRC, about the overwhelming volume of requests for anti-discrimination investigations and remedies, and also public education. So we need them. They're the custodians of anti-discrimination efforts, including protecting from harassment. So I really encourage everyone to support that effort. They do amazing work there. I think that folks should also, the Attorney General's office has been an incredible ally and leader for our movements to support the community at this time. And they also have a civil rights unit. And you can, if you see something, say something from an injustice perspective, right? We need state leaders to know what is happening because they don't, right? They don't, if we don't tell them, they might not know. And certainly folks can filter stories through us and, we can track patterns and be a voice, but it's so much more powerful when it's coming from impacted communities directly. And so when their injustice is happening, like using the opportunities of any hearings or committee meetings or public meetings to make those stories known is important. And finally, I would encourage everyone to educate themselves. Information has never been more available, and that includes good information, right? Where it's not just the VAAP website, although I am partial to the VAAP website, which some UVM students are helping me to improve and grow. Shout out to the Department of Social Work. But people can inform themselves, and then you can be part of informing your neighbors and colleagues and coworkers and community members and leadership, so that people can have access to good information, and we can try and minimize harm to impacted communities.
Great. Well, thank you. Those are some really good examples of how we can better support our communities, and a little bit about how we can support VAAP, but I'm curious if there's any other ways that we can provide support to VAAP.
Well, frankly, the most emergent need for us as an organization is the existential threat we face based on the new Department of Justice policy directives. We are a BIPOC, queer, and trans-led immigrant defense shop. We are 50% federally funded. We fully expect to lose all of that funding. We fully expect heightened scrutiny as an organization. And we're we're torn between providing direct services, which are now like much more resource intensive than they were 2 months ago. The same legal cases are taking a lot more work because, the immigration bar refers to it as like the Trump administration is throwing sand in the gears of how the system's working. Even though the law hasn't changed, the functioning has changed. So we're torn between like keeping up with our professional duties and then also diversifying our funding to be able to survive this moment. So we have a great partnership with a national funder, the Immigrant Justice Corps. We are hosting Vermont's first pool of nationally competitive fellows, and that's a relationship that continues to grow. But they need a supervising attorney. and I'm in the position of having to replenish federal funds. So I have a funding cliff this year. Every amount helps, no matter how small. And then I think the other way folks can help VAAP is thinking about immigration-related resistance work or resource generation work that doesn't need a lawyer or a legal intervention. Like you might consider setting up a rapid response network in your community or setting up an accompaniment program for people going to ICE appointments or immigration appointments, like legal observer work in your community. We can provide some technical assistance to help you launch that work. But we're at capacity. We can't coordinate any other volunteer programs besides our legal volunteers. And so, if folks are feeling like I want to help, we're not the right coordinating body, but we can help you access some tools to set up coordination work in your community.
Great. So lots of opportunities for involvement and support. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
We'll certainly be sharing that with our listeners.
Thanks. And actually, I would be remiss. The biggest request for assistance from a systemic perspective that I would ask from the community is attention on Senate Bill 56, which has been proposed this session by Senator Gulick. This is a bill that will pave the way for an Office of New Americans equivalent in Vermont. About half the states have an Office of New Americans equivalent. I recognize that name is harmful, but for the sake of clarity with lawmakers, we're going to use the national term, even though it's exclusive of folks who have always been American and happen to be immigrants. But we want to set up, we're working in coalition with interdisciplinary partners statewide to try and set up at least one position in the state government that can be the central coordination point and clearinghouse for good information, for data, for advocacy, for grant making, for systems level solutions to systems level problems. Treasurer Pichak the other day said to me, when I was telling him what it's like to go through uncoordinated immigration response in this moment, he was like, it sounds like you're going through the immigration equivalent of COVID without a Department of Health. And that is what it feels like.
I can imagine. Well, thank you again for spotlighting that and all of the different ways that folks can take part in this. And I am already sensing more links, more resources to add into the description of this episode on our social media, all that good stuff. I feel like this has been so valuable to not just me, but our listeners as well. And just because we have gone through a lot, I have nothing left for you. But I'm curious if there's anything else at all that you would like our listeners to be aware of.
I think the final message I would share with your listeners is that fear is the strategy. Look at how much currency fear has, how like the chilling effect that a blatantly illegal policy document has on the way that we move through communities, the way that we as organizations show up to provide services. Fear is the strategy. And when we are giving in to fear without clear guidance on implementation, actual bottom lines of what we do need to change about how we work, we're accomplishing the Trump administration's bigoted purposes all on our own, right? We're making it very cost effective for them to just threaten us and say we might take away birthright citizenship, which is blatantly illegal. And now we're also terrified that everyone's scrubbing DEI from their websites. I would really encourage people this is a time to lean into self-care, community care, to practice mental health practices, regulation practices, and to try and create a practice for yourself to resist the urge to panic and react, slow yourself down and respond. I would caution people against preemptively implementing blatantly illegal policy directives, and to try not to, be moving through the community in reaction to fear, but instead dialing into good information and working toward a coordinated response.
Gosh, thank you so much. What a perfect way to end our conversation today. Thank you again so much, Jill, for being here, and Penny for being here as well. And gosh, just for all of the insanely important, valuable, meaningful work that you're doing. I'll let you get back to it, but thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Of course.
She heard her name. She was like, come on.
Sorry I woke you up, Penny. Big thanks to Jill Martin Diaz for sitting down with us today and talking all about immigration. If you'd like to learn more about this episode, please check out the description below for lots of linked resources, but also you can check out vperg.org, get on our mailing lists, and follow us on social media. Don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars. If you have any thoughts, questions, ideas for future episodes, be sure to reach out to me at jheiden@vperg.org. That's JHEIDEN@vpirg.org. I'd love to give a special shout out to my co-producers, Elijah and Katie. And of course, as you know, I'm Jordan Heiden, and this is Vermont's Voice.